Hey, everybody. This is Brenda Green with the Be Strong Group, and welcome to our next Tuesday chat. We have a great topic of discussion tonight. But again, Brenda Green with the Be Strong Group. I am the founder and CEO of this nonprofit. My husband and I founded in honor of our son, Braden, who has sickle cell disease. And we decided to host discussions concerning topics that are important to our warriors as well as our caregivers of warriors, and to just share with our community. So this topic is applicable, really, a lot of the times the topics that we have are applicable to everybody who's listening. So I appreciate you listening in, and I want you to know this is for educational purposes only. You know, the mission of our nonprofit is to spread awareness of sickle cell disease through education, advocacy, and empowerment. So tonight is for educational purposes. And if there's any question or concern or question that you have that's specific to you or your child as far as their health, I ask that you take it back to your primary care provider or your child specialist, and then ask them based on your personal health. But we are so happy you're listening tonight. And for those of you who are listening on replay, thank you for checking in. But tonight we will be talking about sickle cell trait. And that's something that's very important. And, you know, we say to all of our followers, it's important to know your sickle cell trait status. And I definitely am super excited that we have an expert in this topic, and his name is Farron Dozier. We're going to bring Farron to the stage. Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you today?
I'm great. I am so great. And I'm so glad and honored that you have joined us to educate our listeners, to let them know all about sickle cell trait, all the importance parts of it. But before we get started, can you share a little about yourself as an advocate?
So I am a sickle cell trait advocate, Farron. I'm a retired Army Sergeant First Class, 24 years in the military, earned that, medically retired, and we'll get into that part of my life story, how I get to be in front of you today. I've been at it for 10 years. And like I said, when we get into the conversation, I'll let you know more about that. But I'm a grandfather. I have daughters, 3 daughters. My youngest daughter has sickle cell trait. My grandson, her son did not inherit the trait. So right now the buck stops with her, because I'm not having no more kids. So it's up to her. But yeah, definitely a very important conversation. Thank you for inviting me. It's Sickle Cell Awareness Month. So, you know, it's not just the only time we talk about this. We talk about this all year long, but this month we get to make sure we, you know, address conversations about sickle cell. So thank you.
Oh, again, thank you for being here. And I know this topic, I know a lot of times our nonprofit, we talk about sickle cell disease. We talk about everything sickle cell disease. And we do mention it's important to know your status, or, you know, how a child is born with sickle cell disease. One parent or both parent has to have the trait. And in our situation, I have hemoglobin C and my husband has the trait. So our son has SC disease. But can you just, first of all, just share, what is sickle cell trait?
So sickle cell trait is where we as a trait carriers only carry one copy of the S gene. So we have one normal A and one S. And you can also find out, if you're a trait carrier, what percentage of sickle cell trait you carry as well, because I didn't find that out until years later, that I have almost 40% of my red blood cells are the S gene.
Wow.
And so that's so we're AS. For people who live with sickle cell anemia or sickle cell disease, they say has either 2 copies of the S, or 1 S or 1 C. As an advocate for sickle cell trait, I make sure that I tell people, even if you have the trait, you have to ask your mate to either know their status or go get them tested, because as your experience having sickle cell trait and then having C trait, some people don't know that they carry that other red blood cell condition like C trait, D trait, OARAB, Monroe, thalassemia. So if you don't know that your mate has one of those other types of inherited genes, you can have a child with a form of sickle cell disease. So that is something that we make sure we share.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned if you don't know, because you have to know and you can share. And there's ways to find out. Can you just mention some ways a person can find out if they have the trait?
Yeah, definitely. You want to there's sickle dex test out there where you do the finger prick. But at my organization, at What's the Count on Sickle Cell Trait Prevention, we offer the hemoglobin electrophoresis. So if you do the hemoglobin electrophoresis, it's a blood draw, and they do a panel of your blood work, and it picks up, like I said, the other types of red blood cell conditions, not just like the sickle dex does S and C. But if you do the hemoglobin electrophoresis, you can find out the other types of red blood cell. And sometimes the sickle dex is not a false, it's like a false positive sometimes. So it
Mhm.
doesn't tell you, you might have, somebody could do that test and have sickle cell anemia and not know, it just says the S. So you want to, we recommend the hemoglobin electrophoresis. And if you want to go deeper than that, then you can do those DNA tests that tell you where all your bloodline is from, if you want to go that deep.
Right. And I
Yeah.
know here for those who are local here who are listening, the James R. Clark Sickle Cell Foundation offers testing here. So wherever you are, you can search for your local sickle cell organization and ask them the best place in your community. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And another thing about knowing, so if you have the trait and you need to let your partner know who you're going to
Yeah.
make with so they can get tested and you can both make a informed decision when it comes down to starting a family.
Yeah, and that's again for me. I'll tell you my story in a second. How I found out about my trait status, and luckily, my daughter's mom didn't have any other red blood cell condition because I had no idea that I was a carrier when I had my daughters, or any of the impacts, the risk factors that I now get to share about. But yeah, making sure our organization. We started out with awareness, education, and prevention, and then sometimes people say, "Oh, yeah, you can't prevent sickle cell." Like, so I've been catching flack for that word prevention for 10 years. For 10 years, I've been doing this. But when people ask me versus make up their own conversation about what I talk about, that prevention is that informative. A lot of people didn't get to, make that choice, ahead of time, and it's not a right or wrong, good or bad, or anything like that. But it's just, if the couple knows ahead of time, they're better prepared, is how I view it. And yes, there is newborn screening, so it depends on what state you're in when that newborn screening started. But for me as an advocate, it's still kind of after the fact for me. And so if we can let people with sickle cell trait or these red blood cell conditions know ahead of time in their relationship that they can have a choice, because you can't control who you fall in love with. I mean, you can try to, but once you're in that relationship, and then you find out, you have this inherited gene, and now you have to make these decisions or choices, because those decisions and choices are different.
Right.
We experience them different. So yes, you can make a decision, but my conversation is, the freedom is in having a choice.
Mhm.
And we don't tell people not to have children. We just say, look, if you have this is your status, these are the risk factors, this is what's possible, and then the choice is yours. And so that's really all we could do in our advocacy work. You can't tell people, what to do with their life and how to
Right.
have children.
Right. But your key word is knowledge and
Yeah.
and choice, the
Yeah.
ability to have a choice and a say. Um, do you want to take questions as we go along the way? I see a question.
Yeah, I could take some questions. Let's see. Well, I wanted to also make sure I shared. So if both parents have sickle cell trait, there is a 50% chance that your child could have sickle cell trait. If both
Mhm.
parents have those inherited genes, there's a 25% chance that your child could be born with sickle cell anemia or a type of sickle cell disease. And then also, if you both have sickle cell trait, there's a 25% that your child could be born with normal hemoglobin. So there's three things that can happen if you're a trait carrier, and your mate has one of those genes. Is you can have a child with just the traits, with nothing at all, or with some form of sickle cell, and that is with each pregnancy. Some people think it
Right.
skips generation. It does not skip generations. Just like your eye color and your hair and your parents didn't get a chance to pick none of that. We wish we could pick our children's eye colors, but just like that, that red blood cell is inherited, so we don't get to pick. So with each pregnancy, that starts over every time. So
Yeah, and you mentioned, and I'm glad we're going along saying how, because I know that was one of my questions that someone asked was, how do how is it diagnosed, or how does you have a
is it
child with
passed?
trait, how does
Yeah.
it pass along? So, but how? Oh, my question almost left my brain, but and it did leave my
It
brain.
did? Okay. So you
We
want me to get into my story, or how do you want me
your
to?
story, and then we'll get into more Q&A and answer
That's
some
fine.
questions in the chat.
Okay. So I'm 51. I've been retired now this year, it'll be 8 years. I joined the military at 19,
Mhm.
a year after high school. My uncle influenced that. He was in the Air Force Reserve and recommended I, take a look at the service from the benefits. And so I'm glad that he did, plant that seed because I had a great career. I had a great, military career. However, um, the Army didn't notify me of my red blood cell. They didn't notify me of my trait. I know that back then they test soldiers for the anemia
Mhm.
with the Army. But I can tell you that last year, November, I believe that came out that the Army specifically focused is now on um, having soldiers take the sickle cell trait test to screen for it.
Oh, okay.
The Marine Corps does, the Air Force, the Navy, because of the different job skills. So when I found out I had my trait, it was 10 years after I had already been serving. I was transferring to another unit, and I had to do this another physical, my second physical, and it was with the Air Force base. And so the Air Force base, because they test that for their pilots and their job skills, they found my trait at age 29. And so the doctor called me like, you need to come back to the clinic. And I'm thinking, oh my God, like, do I have something? Like, what did you find? Like, I'm like, oh my goodness. So I go back and he's like, do you know you have sickle cell trait? I'm like, no. He says, well, we just want to let you know you're a trait carrier. I'm like, hold on a second. I got a cousin with sickle cell disease. It's not the disease. Like, no, you're not. It's not the disease. You're just a carrier. Make sure you don't mate with another person because you can have a child with, all that spiel. No risk factors, no brochure, nothing. So I'm like, okay, cool. I'm like 29. I'm packing up my apartment to move out of state. So in one ear, out the other, and I
Mhm.
go about my career. And when I look back, I can tell you that my mom would say I was 2 years old, but I remember being 5, and my left arm would ache like crazy. It would have this, pain. I would wake up crying out of my sleep, and my grandmother would hold me over the sink and run warm water over my arm. Only thing was soothe the pain. So in 1975, took me to the doctor. The doctor, oh, he's 5. It's growing pains. He's just
Mhm.
growing. He's 5. So that's what we were told at in 1975, that I had growing pains in my arm and that they would go away. Well, I'm 51, and that pain. I just had an episode last night where I had to put some Dr. Sabi cream on there to rub on my arm. So we're finding out that people with sickle cell trait do have some type of complications. It's not always in pain. Sometimes it's anemia type of experiences. A lot of people experience fatigue again because of the oxygen and things like that. So um, the military, like I said, didn't give me any information, and I didn't think to do any research. So there's no fault or blame to the military. And then in 2006, I was out doing the Army physical fitness test. We do that test twice a year, so it's not my first time. I was at a military academy, so I was working on my next rank to be an E8. I was E7 at the time, so graduating that course, I'd have been on the E8 list, promotion list, and then when it was my turn or when I was ready to get promoted, I could have gotten selected. So I'm there. It's like 5:30 in the morning time. We get up, we do the push-ups, sit-ups, and I'm out doing the 2-mile run, and I'm on my last lap, and I could hear my instructor 15:45, 15:46. So I'm like, oh, cool. I'm doing pretty good. I'm 36 years old at the time. I have 17:21 to pass the test, and I hear 15:40s. I'm like, shoot, let me get this thing over and get my best time. And so we're trained to sprint that last lap. So I kicked in that gear, I took off, and then I remember I did feel like this vibration, like this electrical charge, like come over my body when I took off the sprint. But I didn't think anything of it. Like, I'm trying to get my best time. So across the finish line was 16 minutes, put my hands over my head to get air in my lungs, all the stuff we're trained to do. And then all of a sudden I started feeling weird. And I'm like, man, I don't feel good. And then all of a sudden my peripheral just started getting dark. And I'm like, yeah, I'm like, I don't think I'm okay. So I kneel down, I lay back. When I opened my eyes, everything was spinning like a million miles an hour. I was nauseated, my stomach was hurting. So the medics came and got me, rushed me to the local hospital that was in town. Doctor pulls me in, IV in my arm. I'm waiting. He walks in the door and says, "You ever had kidney problems?" I'm like, "No." He says, "What do you do now?" And then he
Oh,
walks out. And I'm like, "What?" I'm like, "What?" So my instructor, Sergeant First Class Losbog, is standing there next to me, and I'm looking at him like, "What is going on?" And we're looking at each other like, "What?" And he's like, "You ever had problem?" I'm like, "Nah, man, I don't know what this dude's talking about." So he comes back in and says, "You know what? Freak accident. I'm gonna give you another IV. Go back to the barracks. Take the rest of the day off. You should be fine." Cool. All right, cool. They get the schoolhouse gave me the day off because there wasn't too much studying going on that day. So I went back to the barracks. I woke up mid-afternoon and I was worse. I
oh,
was throwing up. I almost crapped on myself. Nothing would stay down. Water, Gatorade, banana. Like I couldn't keep anything down. I make it back to my bunk and I go back to sleep because I'm everything is still spinning. So I know it's 4:30 because my classmates come in after after school and they rush me back to the hospital at that night. So I'm in there and the night doctor comes in and he does his blood work and tests, but he sees that my creatinine kinase levels are 12,000 and rising. And so he diagnosed me with having a condition called rhabdomyolysis. And
mhm,
rhabdomyolysis is a skeletal muscular disorder. So what happens is when with rhabdo, and anybody can get rhabdo, um, the muscles enzymes break down and get into the bloodstream. And once it hits the bloodstream, they become toxins. And so now the toxins hit the kidneys, and then with the kidneys, because they can't filter all the toxins, renal failure is possible. So what the doctor saw that morning was renal failure, but the night doctor caught it, and by that time they were about 50% each. My kidneys were. So he just put me on IVs for 4 days, and that flushed out my kidneys. But I had severe muscle weakness. Like I couldn't walk. So it took like 3.5 days for me to get out of that bed just to walk with the IV machine to use the bathroom on my own. So I was in a bad state. So my family comes and picks me up, takes me back home to go see my regular doctor. So I'm done with the schoolhouse. I can't
mhm.
finish. So the school is done. I go back to my doctor's and he sends me to a neurologist because I was still having the dizzy spells. I was still having like vertigo issues. So he looked over me for from 2006 late till 2009 September. And so with him, my CK levels went down to about 600, 500. But every time I would go to the gym to try to see if I could exercise again, I get on the treadmill and it felt like I just got off a roller coaster ride. Like I was still kind of like spinning and kind of out of it. So 2.5 years of that, my doctor, he was like, you know what? You just can't run. Like you can't run anymore. And I'm like, you know what? That's cool. I've seen people in the military with worse cases, broken legs and repaired and all that knee, and they were able to do other exercises. So we have the walk or the bicycle. So I'm like, they'll just give me a alternate event and I'll go about my career. Well, our unit was getting deployed, and so we were doing another physical, and I turned my paperwork in to that board. And when they read my documentation, they were like, nah. They're like, matter of fact, you can't exercise anymore. You can't do anything until we figure out what happened. And I'm like, wait a minute, that was like 2.5 years ago. I just can't run. They're like, nah,
It's
we
more.
got to find out. So they put me on this thing called a P4 profile. I couldn't carry a weapon. I couldn't do anything until they looked over my paperwork. And when they did that, I got an email that said, you're pending discharge. And I'm like, pending discharge? Like, nobody talked to me? Like, shouldn't somebody respond to me or something? So I called and they were like, oh, there was a mistake. You're pending the medical board. So the medical board will determine if you get to stay in the service or not. So there is a process. I can tell you that with my mental health, seeing that email
Mm,
and me making it mean my life is over, I started to spiral in a depression. an anxiety type of that I still deal with today because of that experience. So I have to manage that. But that was also something I started dealing with, was now being depressed because my career is over, not by my choice, and and then all that, my health is now at stake. And so it took them 3 years from 2010 until 2013 for them to finally put all the paperwork together. And my medical board, they found me not fit for service because I was also diagnosed in 2010 for having arthritis. Like my whole body was inflamed. And they said, "Oh, you got arthritis, so you have to be on this medication." And because I was on that medication, it disqualified me for being deployable. So if you're not deployable, you're not good for the service. So there's nothing that I could do. So they medical retired me. I can tell you that during my mental health episodes of that, there was definitely thoughts of wanting to take my life, like it was over, because I made it mean that. And I realized that my identity was also in my camouflage. So you talk about 20 something years of being in the military, and that's who Farron was. I was a sergeant first class. Like it was all that identity. And so one of my mental health providers asked me one day, like, "What are you gonna do when you retire?" And I'm like, "I'm just gonna sit on the dock of the bay, watch the tides roll away, and whistle." And he was like, "You know what? Let me show you this." And he had wrote an article in a book about athletes collapsing with sickle cell trait. And so I read that. I'm like, "You know what happened to me?" He's like, "Oh, yeah, it happens a lot. It also gets misdiagnosed because people die from heart attacks, but they don't look at the sickle cell trait being the trigger in that collapsing, and especially with the rhabdo." And I was like, he's like, "Well, you could be an advocate." I'm like, "What's an advocate?" He's like, "You could actually share your story and then travel and educate people." And I was like, "You kidding me?" And so, like, in the midst of my depression, like the cartoon character with the light bulb, it was like, I know what I could do. And then I started looking into sickle cell trait and research and reading and finding all these articles of the military from the 70s and 80s where people have collapsed and died from sickle cell trait. Then I found in the athletics that football players and people running track and boxing and all these different activities have collapsed and died. And a lot of those deaths were sickle cell trait related. And then I found, the Darling family, and I found Dr. Austin, and I found the As One Foundation. I found all these, small organizations that were focusing on sickle cell trait. And I'm like, I actually have a voice in this. Like I have that gene, I have this experience, and I saw that I could use my voice to help bring awareness, if anything. And so that has really kept me alive. I say that God blessed me because this sickle cell trait is in my DNA. I was born with it. And so I believe that we're born for a reason, and we're born to solve a problem in the world. And if you believe that about your illness, that could be your voice, and you getting to share and help people around you realize that they're not the only ones, but then also help drive a force of knowledge and education and understanding, so people in the next generation has an opportunity to not go through these things that I did in the military. So selling that in my heart has allowed me to find that level of peace. And so when I'm asked to speak, it doesn't matter. Like I will go anywhere on the planet. I've flown to Germany. I've been asked to speak at a military family day. So it's taken me places that I never imagined. Even HBCU tours with my sickle cell community that I shared this conversation with. So it's been a blessing to be able to bring awareness to this gene. They say that 300 million people globally have sickle cell trait, and millions still don't know that they have that gene. And many don't know that there are risk factors. A lot of people were just told, make sure you don't mate with another person. And that's pretty much all they were given. But we're advocating, is sickle cell trait, is it benign or not? Because if it has these complications, if you look at the CDC website, they have all these different health complications that go along with it. Not that it has to be labeled a disease, but you got to let people know that if there are risk factors, that these are the things this is what's possible. And not every person with sickle cell trait is going to have an exertion experience. But if you are out exercising or you're a scuba diver with the trait, that might not be a good place for you to hang out, scuba diving, because of the oxygen levels. And places like Denver, Colorado, or Cheyenne, Wyoming, where the oxygen levels are thin, you might want to make sure you get acclimatized to those environments before you start just going out and exercising or doing, extreme, functions in your athletics. So those are the things that I've been able to, share, my experience. Again, with our traits and our diseases, you don't have to, but you want to know that your experience is valuable, and
Oh, absolutely.
and you can help people understand or at least relate to you, and then that furthers the conversation. Because if you try to understand me, you're gonna, oh, I don't have the trait, so I'm not gonna listen to him. But
Mhm.
you just don't know that you could be around someone that's going through this, and you would have this information to help take care of that person. So we don't want you to discount that you're not a trait carrier and you don't know about it. It's not important to you. It is very important, because you can help us bring this message out further. If you're
Absolutely.
not a carrier or disease patient or whatever that is in our community, you are our ally. Like, we need
Right.
you. We need your voice. So yeah, that's pretty much my story now. And I created an organization called What's the Count on Sickle Cell Trait Prevention. Very small. It allows me to go out and speak. I travel to military bases once a month or almost every other month when there's a class. I actually go to the base where I collapsed. So I actually go there, became a resident speaker there. So when all the students come there for their course, I get to share. I drive up and share my experience, and then give them the knowledge and information. And that has been great as well, because it makes people think about their own health, even
Mhm.
if it's not sickle cell trait. They're like, hey, I collapsed one time from this and that. Like, well, you might want to go get this blood work done, and so you can help people, give them information and guidance, and again, so they don't feel like they're alone.
Right. Farron, first of all, thank you for sharing your story. It's so powerful. It's so powerful.
Yeah,
So through you sharing your story, it shows how important it is for us all to know our trait status.
yeah,
For you, by you sharing your powerful story, your voice is helping those who may not feel they have a voice.
yeah,
You're spreading knowledge about this, and like you said, did I just blink out? Our
yeah. You're
allies,
still there.
okay, our allies, can help us advocate, can help us spread the word,
Yeah,
can probably recognize someone in a similar situation. Um, and actually, sharing your story touched on a lot of questions that I had gotten
mm-hmm.
earlier. And just for example, where it asks, why should I be concerned, or what's some of the complications with sickle cell trait? A lot of
Yeah,
times you do hear, I've heard comments saying, well, you know, unless you have the disease, you're fine. So with the
yeah,
trait, I heard that early on, but of course, through talking to people like yourself and reading and understanding, I know it's a bigger deal. You know, there are
yes.
some complications. So once again, can you share some of the complications associated outside of the exertion and
Yeah,
um,
so there's spleen infarction, where
mhm,
some people have collapsed and had their spleen explode. I know Ryan Clark, if you're familiar with the Pittsburgh
mhm.
Steelers, he was playing against the Broncos in Denver and collapsed from his exertion and lost his spleen and gallbladder through that exertion. There is a rare kidney cancer um, as well. You talk about the eyes. Sometimes you can have a crisis, and the retina in your eyes can have its complications. There's pain, again, fatigue, um, and like I said, I met people who have crisis they've had pain in their arms. Sometimes we think as athletes or military that it's cramps. Sometimes it feels like cramps, but it may not be cramps all the time. So those are some of the basic blood clots. Unfortunately, we have to pay attention to those as well. You could be flying too much, like now that when I fly, I have to make sure that I turn that air on, because I was getting sick on the descent of the plane. And they say you're not supposed to, but hmm, who determines what rare is? And so in those rare cases, people have gotten sick, flying as well. Like I said, skiing in Denver and the Aspens where the oxygen levels is thin. So just we advocate for just pay attention to your body. Your body will tell you what's going on, and it doesn't make you less of an athlete or a soldier if you have sickle cell trait. You just might need to uh, warm up slower. You have, work your way up to those competitive repetitions, things like that, like hydration before, during, and after. Like there's things that we just have to be aware, because that, especially in football, that culture is that water is weakness. In some sports, water is weakness. And we can't keep pushing that kind of conversation when people are dealing with red blood cell conditions that require hydration, in athletics or military. Um, and then it's been so important that the NCAA made it mandatory for all student athletes to play sports. So it doesn't matter if you are male or female, black, white, Asian, you have to do that sickle cell trait test or sign a waiver, because of all the deaths that have happened in college. They don't want to be responsible. So now they put it back on the families. And so people are getting the sickle cell trait test done, but still don't know the reasons why behind it, just so they could play sports. So there is still a piece of that conversation missing that we've been working to step into, to say, hey, look, there are risk factors. This is why you have to have this test, and not just for your genetics and your relationship, but also because your athletic career. And if you experience something, it could trigger rhabdo, and then with rhabdo, you can trigger sudden death. And we have had, even recently, there has been some athletes have collapsed.
Right.
And in military as well. I interviewed a mom a couple weeks ago. Her daughter passed away at the Navy boot camp from sickle cell trait exertion with rhabdo, and she was young. She was in the basic training of Navy Academy, and she was a African American female, right before or after a Caucasian female, same with sickle cell trait at the Navy, same Navy Academy, collapsed and died from sickle cell trait exertion. So people think, it's just African Americans. We are number one. Yes, we own that. However, you can be Caucasian, Mediterranean, European, Asian descent. You have to know your bloodline. It's not a color. It's not your skin color.
Right.
So that I could do it. I'm thinking about, if I just did a campaign on this, not a black gene, for the next 20 years, maybe that would move the needle for people to be aware that it's not just us, but the Hispanic community is number two. But again, I've met people with blonde hair, blue eyes that had sickle cell trait. And when we had a conversation, their dad was mixed with black and white. So he had the trait. So again, you can no longer just go by a skin color. You have to know where your ancestors are from, and you have to have that blood test done. You can't tell by just looking. And what was I going to say lastly? And it has a purpose. They say that sickle cell trait was created to combat malaria. Mm-hmm. So in those parts of the country where malaria was present, that gene was the body created that defective gene. So when they caught malaria, that red blood cell died off faster and came back faster, and they were able to survive malaria. So in that part of the world, it has a purpose. It combats malaria. You have a chance to live. But here in the United States, it's about, making sure you don't mate. And now with sickle cell trait exertion and exercising. So we don't really have a malaria issue here in the United States. So our conversation is a little bit different than those other parts of the world. So same gene, two different global conversations, but they all have an impact on our bodies.
And I'm glad you mentioned about everybody should know. This is not just a black disease. This is not a race disease. This is a genetic blood disorder. Yeah. So I'm glad you point that out. I know we just made a post about that as well. And we get that a lot with sickle cell disease and trait. It's not a black condition. It's not a black disease. So I'm glad
you. And I want to say this, especially for our allies who are C trait like yourself, and D
Mhm.
trait, and OA Rab and Monroe, and the other believe like 400 different types of red blood cell conditions. You too have to be aware of your exercise status, because it's not just sickle cell trait that can cause these health complications. I've met people who have C trait that have had issues exercising, bloody noses, and that C trait, with that C trait, that it crystallizes. So when it gets expressed, like your child who lives with sickle cell SC, he has one gene that mutates and one gene that crystallizes. So you got two things going on with those red blood cells. And so you, even if you're, the parent of a child and you have thalassemia or C trait, you want to be aware of the risk factors that come with that gene, just the same as we talk about sickle cell trait, because they are doing something to our bodies. And that's what we're trying to find out. What is this one gene doing to us? Because it's doing something. And it's no competition to the sickle cell disease community. It's just that we want, as trait carriers, we want to find out, what is this gene doing to our health, because we know what it does with two copies,
Right.
but they haven't researched us to find out what is that one. Or they done some, because like I said, they have some,
Well,
the CDC has a sickle cell trait toolkit that they created about in 2012, and that's where they have the list of the different risk factors and complications with sickle cell trait. So it's not that we want it to be a disease, it's the fact that there's millions of people that live with this, and they're just not aware of the risk factors. And if we can promote what those risk factors are, and one day in their older age they express themselves, they can at least start to, let me check off my trait. Was it trait related? No, because we inherit 23 chromosomes from each parent, so you got 46 chromosomes. That everything is not always sickle cell trait related is what I tell the community as well. You just can't stop there and think it's just your trait that's causing all these health issues. You might inherit something else from your parents in that bloodline. So that hemoglobin electrophoresis will help you start to, determine, where to look for your health.
okay. Oh, this is great. Let's take a couple of questions.
Okay.
We have one from Brianna. How soon do you recommend a person getting tested? I guess if they don't currently know their status.
Well, if you have medical insurance, or you can find a clinic, or a sickle cell organization that does testing, I say don't wait. I mean, if you know, if it's in your bloodline, um, on your parents or your dad's side, talk to your family. A lot of times, we don't have these kind of personal conversations with our parents. And something that I'm realizing around that is, as children, we grow up and our brains are maturing. It's creating life, it's giving meanings. And sometimes there's a natural break in communication with that child to that parent, and then we don't feel like as a children we can talk to our parents. So then now you don't get a chance to have these personal, intimate relationship conversations with your parents about your bloodline and where your ancestors are from, because maybe your dad disappointed you one day, or your mom disappointed you, so you feel like, I don't want to talk, I can't talk to them. So but you don't realize that you're missing out on so much of your history and so much of that relationship and that connectedness. And so find that space. If you don't have a close relationship with your mom or dad, I ask you to just, before you criticize them of their behavior, find out how they grew up. Find out, how their relationship was with their parents. Find out how, if your grandparents are alive, talk to your grandparents and find out how they grew up. And then you'll see that your parents really do love you. They just are trying to make sure that you're safe and taken care of. And so those things I could see gets in the way of why we don't have these, conversations with our parents about, hey, do we have any health issues in our family? Like, it takes courage, like it takes a space to be able to have those conversations. And sometimes you may not want to know, because whatever reason, but you want to know what, especially if you have a red blood cell condition that you can pass to your children, or create a child that has a type of sickle cell. So if you think it's in your bloodline, or you having experiences, I would just say, as soon as possible, make a doctor's appointment, find a hematologist. You can get genetic counseling if you do have that sickle cell trait. So if you found out you had it, you can reach out to a genetic counselor. They can give you more information about your trait. I can tell you, when my youngest daughter was born, this is what's crazy. Deja was born in 98. I found my trait in 99.
Wow.
So I got her when she was born. I got that letter from the hospital saying that your daughter has sickle cell trait, blah, blah, blah. I took that letter, we read it, I folded it up, we put it in a drawer. And then the next year is when I did my physical, and I still didn't
Wow.
reflect. I still didn't reflect back to the letter I got about her as a baby. So sometimes as parents, we take those letters and we don't think anything about it, and we fold them away and we put them in a drawer, and then we never sometimes tell that child when they're growing up, oh, by the way, you were born with this sickle cell trait. You've got to make sure you do this and that. So if a parent doesn't remember, how do you know?
Right.
And how I remembered, so in 99, I found out I was a trait carrier. In
Mhm.
2010, I was leaving a mental health appointment, and the officer that I served with during the war, 0405, I was a platoon sergeant. He was my platoon leader. So we ran the company, the unit together, platoon together for a year. Never talked about, I wasn't an advocate back then in 2005. So we never had a talk, but I did have health issues on that deployment. There was times that my hands swelled up, my feet, I could barely walk, right? And so I would have to walk around with no boots and stuff on. So I seen him in 2010, 5 years later. 5 years I hadn't seen this guy, and we passed each other on the base. And he's like, "How you been?" I'm like, "You don't want to know." He's like, "Tell me." I'm like, "Man, I could barely walk. My muscles hurt. I'm depressed, and I'm like, I'm in a bad." And he's like, "You know what? Something like that happened to me where my muscles locked up. But I have sickle cell trait. So I have to drink extra water, take these vitamins." And I'm like, why does that sound familiar?
Mm.
And then that triggered my memory about the test from 99. And I
Right.
went in and got that physical from 99 and read it. I was like, oh, shoot, right there. Positive sickle cell trait AS. I took that to my rheumatologist. I'm like, look, you need to see this. And then so she retested my blood, and that's when I found out what percentage of trait I had. And then with that diagnosis information, we were able to put the rhabdo together with the sickle cell trait, and that's how I realized that my trait was connected to the rhabdo when I collapsed in 2006, and this is 2010. So
Wow.
that conversation with him, that's how valuable, sharing knowledge and information is with our community, because 5 years I hadn't seen him, and I knew him, and had not it been for that day that we passed, that I was able to just say, hey, you know what, this is what I'm dealing with. He shared, I have the trait and I've had my muscles locked up
Mm.
from exercising. So that was enough for me to remember my status, and then that test that I had done. And then it was like, oh my goodness, you
Right.
mean this is what can happen to sickle cell? And so that began the journey of how I found out that rhabdo was connected to the trait.
See, this is why we need you. This is why we need to hear your voice. This is why we need other advocates so
Yes.
we can share information like this with our community, our listeners. And then the importance, oh, you threw out several gems. But the importance of talking with your family
Yes.
about health situation, all of it. You
All
know,
of it.
so,
Yeah.
us as Black folks, in the past, we keep things secret. A lot of things
Yes.
are secret, don't need to be told. You definitely don't need to stress the children out with it.
Yes.
Even,
Yes.
with our story, initially, I didn't share for years because I was in that woe is me thing. I was
Yes.
feeling guilty,
Yes.
embarrassed because I gave the worst of me to my child. And that
Yes.
was not helping. That was
Yes.
not helping. So now we share it all. As far as, especially, I talked to my family and I had to dig a lot of information out, my side and my husband's side. Okay,
Yes.
tell me everything, because we also needed to be knowledgeable to ensure
Yes.
our son was going to have the best opportunity to have the best life he could. But we had
Yes.
to know. So I'm glad you touched on that.
And
We
and
got
I think and I think, not that I think, but for me, sometimes I could see how the word prevention could be offensive sometimes, because I can only imagine, like, I don't have a child with the disease, but I have one with the trait, but I can only imagine the mental toughness that has to come with that, right? So if you hear in prevention and you have a sickle cell patient, that hears prevention, like, are you saying that I shouldn't have been born? No, we're not saying that you shouldn't have been born. Right. We're saying that, yes, there is an emotional part of that, of what a parent could only feel, like you said, of passing that gene to that child and not knowing. Of course, there's going to be some kind of emotional, whatever that is. But for us as advocates, it's not that, no, we're saying that your preventions, you shouldn't have been born. It's more of an informative and giving families an opportunity. Like I said, if that family, if that couple knows that they're both trait carriers and they know what's possible, it's up to them to figure out if they want to have a child. But if they do have a child, at least they're prepared some type of way with knowledge and information, and maybe even a level of mental toughness that, okay, this is what's possible if we have a child. So they're not surprised. Right. Because what bothers me, it doesn't bother me, but I can only imagine, again, if after you're having the child and then the doctor tells you during your pregnancy that you're going to be having a child with the disease, now are you going to have an abortion, or now are you going to keep? And so that all that stuff comes with, if you don't know what your status is. And if we can have the first bite of the apple, which could be that awareness, then people have an opportunity to make those informative choices. So the prevention from me is not like saying you shouldn't have been born. It's more of informative knowledge, wisdom, understand. All that stuff comes in with just being aware that you have this gene and then making some choices.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's important, because being able to make that choice, being informed, is huge. Yeah. And when you're not, it can be devastating.
Yeah. And now you have to deal with you got to forgive yourself. Like, that's where all this forgiveness starts to come in, on the stress of the parents. And if they have that ahead of time, not saying that they won't have the stress, but at least they can't, they have a, they can say, well, they did tell us, they could say that they did tell us. So that's my piece for the awareness. Yes.
Okay. We got a couple of comments here. Okay. Patrick Green, I can relate. The U.S. Marine Corps didn't inform me.
Okay.
And we got some right-ons. And I think when you were talking about the malaria, they never knew that about malaria.
They advocate they need mosquito nets in those parts. So they advocate for mosquito nets.
Right. And one of our listeners, Adrian, she said, we've come a long way. In the 70s, my mom had to request that we were tested. In the 2000s, both my kids were tested at birth without me requesting. So
yeah, that's the newborn screening. Newborn, depending on what state you're from, the newborn screening started somewhere in the 90s for many states. So it just depends on what state. And even you got to be careful with that, because some states still don't do the newborn screening unless you ask for it.
Wow.
Or if it's a suspect in the family. So you still want to make sure that you are aware of the trait status.
Okay, here's another question. Has the trait been known to be more prevalent in a certain gender?
No. I can tell you that. So on my dad's side, my dad was tested at 60, because I knew if his nephew has the trait, has the disease, then I knew it wasn't on my mom's side. So come to find out that my dad's a trait carrier, and like 3 of my aunts are trait carriers, and my cousins have the trait. So it's prevalent on my dad's side, and it's not a more men or women. I would say you just, like I said, if you're born with that gene, there's a purpose for it.
Absolutely. And the same thing with that. When I found out when my son was born that I had hemoglobin C, I made everybody get tested. Everybody got to get tested, because we need to know who has the C.
Exactly.
And as far as my daughter was tested as well. So it's, I tell you, being informed.
You got it, yeah.
And then we had a couple of comments, being proactive versus reactive.
Yeah, definitely.
Into our conversation.
Takes courage too.
Absolutely. So if a person has the sickle cell trait, is their blood cell shape normal or slightly sickled?
Yeah. So what happens is that 40% of my red blood cells that are the S trait. Um, I have a doctor on my board, Dr. Maisha, and how she explains it is that red blood cell that has the S is a little bit more stiffer and stickier than the normal ones. And so when I had my rhabdo, those cells they say mutated, so they depleted like a person with sickle cell anemia. So they did mutate, and that's how I lost that 40% oxygen to my body, which triggered the rhabdo. So yes, those red blood cells, the red blood cells, S trait, S genes live about 20 days. When your normal A live about 120 days. So you can see why a person with sickle cell anemia or disease um, has that pain, because those red blood cells are dying off quicker than your normal A's survive. So yeah, that S gene can mutate, and that's why we're saying that you've got to know what the risk factors are. And lastly, I'm gonna say this too, because before I was doing all this work, when I would catch a cold or go to my doctor, and she would do blood work, my bilirubin count would be high. Like, and so one day I had this one particular doctor, and she was like, "Do you have liver disease?" I'm like, "I don't have no liver disease. What you talking about? What you talking about?" So she would make me fast and come back because my liver count was so high.
Mhm.
But I didn't know that the red blood cells, they when they die off, they can get stuck in the liver, which causes the bilirubin count to be high. And also, if you look at some of the risk factors, sometimes the diabetes test could be a false positive,
Mhm.
because sickle cell trait can also trigger a false positive in some of those tests as well. So knowing your status can help navigate your health again. So it's very important, um, whatever type of red blood cell condition you have, because like I said, I met a army officer who had thalassemia trait, and he had a rhabdo exertion with thalassemia. So
Mm.
it's like you've got to know, your red blood cell condition and what you carry.
Right. And you
You have
mentioned
to.
diabetes. That's important too, because I've learned with Braden, because we have diabetes on both sides of the family, and we
Hmm.
get him tested for that as well.
Yeah.
But because he has sickle cell disease, you can't count on the normal diabetes
Yes.
at the
Yeah.
age,
You can't.
because he doesn't have any of that. So
Right.
there is another test that doctors can use to detect, to diagnose diabetes. So
Yeah, so that
put
trait
that
can give
I'm
a
glad
false
you mentioned that.
positive.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it's important. That was another question. Um, should I tell a doctor, or if I'm in the ER, that I have sickle cell trait? Why is that important?
Oh, yeah. So I wish my daughter. So my daughter advocates with me too now. And so definitely, if you're a woman and you are pregnant, sometimes women with sickle cell trait can have complications. So when you do surgeries and things like that, you want to make sure that they have some blood on hand, just in case you need some blood replenished. And so yeah, definitely, I would make sure that your doctors know. And if you have the trait, I really recommend you find a hematologist. You really want to add a hematologist to your care, so that you have another um, medical professional to bounce your information off of, and not just your primary doctor, but also a hematologist, so they can work together to help make sure that you're taken care of. Because sometimes you might need hydration therapy. It just depends on how severe your trade experiences is because of the fatigue. And I will say this, and this is something that I've been, I guess I could say, blessed to help discover this conversation and move it forward. Um, Sometimes with people with sickle cell trait, when you do your blood work, uh, it breaks down your A, your S, and if you have some fetal hemoglobin, some people as adults still carry a little small percentage of fetal hemoglobin. But also, if there's something going on with your DNA, your A2 percentage
Mhm.
can be high or low. And so, what we discovered, some people with sickle cell trait have been misdiagnosed because they also have alpha thalassemia. And sometimes that alpha thalassemia could cause some iron issues or some anemia type of issues, or even cause some health complications as well. So you want to look, if you do your blood work as a trait carrier, you want to also pay attention to the A2 percentage. I believe Dr. Maisha says if it's over like 4% or higher, that could not just be sickle cell trait, it could be beta thalassemia, because she says that if the A2s are high, it could be producing more A2s because there's no beta chain there. And so if it's your A2s are high, you want to look at that number as well. So we've met people as we started this conversation that have had, they talk about their pain and their health issues. And I'm like, man, you sound like, that doesn't sound like just sickle cell trait. That sounds like a sickle cell disease. And so we're like, hey, go back and do some blood work. And sure enough, we have found people that have had alpha thalassemia or had beta or had SC because they thought the SC was a trait and the doctors just didn't know, or the parents, they didn't know how to read the paperwork correctly. So being this advocate for sickle cell trait, it has helped, fulfill so many different conversations, because a lot of times, unfortunately, people with sickle cell trait have been misdiagnosed, and we've met people, we've helped, and Dr. Maisha is now helping push that conversation that alpha thalassemia, the A2s, you got to look at that number just the same, because with thalassemia, you could have too many red blood cells or not enough red blood cells or smaller red blood cells with thalassemia. So it just depends on what type that you have. And again, it could be silent. And because alpha thalassemia and trait is not considered the disease, it's just considered having the trait.
Right.
Beta, sickle cell beta thalassemia is what they consider the disease. But again, that A2 percentage could be high enough that it could be beta, and people just didn't know, what their status was and what those percentages are.
Right. You are giving us so much good information. And I know we're coming up
is it already?
And I don't want to hold you too long.
Oh no, I'm good.
Okay. And then
it's our awareness month.
Yeah, Sickle Cell Awareness Month. So we're gonna talk about all of it. So would you also recommend a hematologist with thalassemia trait?
Oh, definitely. He's retired. I have a friend who was Filipino, and I was doing this work as I was getting out of the service. And so he started sharing with me, like, man, when I go to the gym now to work out, I start feeling dizzy. I'm like, man, hold on. Your sister has thalassemia disease, right? He's like, yeah. So that means you could have thalassemia. Nah, I don't have that. I don't have that. I'm like, man, look, go to the clinic and get your blood work done, man, just so you can find out. Well, he went back and they found that he has alpha thalassemia. But his thalassemia, he has too much red blood cells. So they were pulling out blood to keep him from getting sick. So that was with thalassemia.
Wow.
Trait. So he was going every couple of weeks to get blood taken out because his blood count was so high. So that's what I'm saying. As an advocate for trait, we have to I make sure that I share with our community, that because our community is mixed with different types of red blood cell, as having children, that thalassemia is a part of our community, just the same. So we have to be responsible for what thalassemia looks like, so that those families can go back and check and make sure that, hey, my health might be impacted by just my thalassemia trait too. Yes, it could be impacted by it. So yeah, any red blood cell condition, I would recommend, having a hematologist, because they specialize in the blood work. Your regular doctor, unless they used to do it back in the day, but you want to have that on your team. So when you start having, your health complications or whatever with your health, that you have that, you have that system in place. So I would definitely recommend with thalassemia. C-trait too. C-trait for sure. I met people at sickle cell conferences, with C-trait that was like, man, my nose bleeds and blah, blah, blah. You might want to go get checked. You might want to go make sure that C-trait is not, expressing itself, and at what percentage you carry it as well.
Yeah. And you guys, you're listening tonight. This is our Tuesday chat. We're talking about sickle cell trait. And if you're just joining us after we're done, you need to start over and listen from the beginning because it's so much valuable information that has been shared. And Farron, how can people get in touch with you or follow you?
Yeah, so I put right there by my name. I've just put
Okay.
my organization, my Instagram for my organization, WDC on SCT. Same thing for the website is WDConsct.org. You can find me as well on those platforms. And again, I'm just blessed. I'm telling you, I've been able to just discover that this has been my message to share, with our community, with my generation and the generation behind us. So I survived that exertion to be able to have these conversations with you and the people in our community. So it could start that, research or whatever they need to hear. As you mentioned, I'm just blessed to be able to share that.
Oh wow. It looks like because I'm getting some questions texted.
Uh-huh.
It looks like we're gonna have a part two.
Oh,
Come back and share some more
for
information.
sure. For sure.
And make sure you follow him.
Yeah.
He has his
I have a talk show. So I've been doing blog talk. I started my blog talk show out of my depression.
Mhm.
That was I was a huge sports fan, and when I got depressed, a friend of mine was like, "You should, do something." And so I started Blog Talk in 2010, and I still keep that platform. But I do also interview people in our community living with sickle cell or living with the trait. So you're more than welcome to be a part of my show as well.
Okay.
I have a show there on Blog Talk. I have a Sunday night show on 8 o'clock at 8 o'clock on KCA Radio, where I do more of a music and talk. But I do share my sickle cell trait there for my community here where I live at. So yeah, I'm always looking for people to come on my show as well and share your experience and your information and knowledge as well. So it's open to the public.
Yeah, and in our conversation, I'm over here taking notes because you reminded me, we need to have a show on labs, understanding and knowing your
Yeah.
labs, knowing, when you see those numbers, the creatine, blue, which one you
The bilirubin,
and the
the
belly
creatinine
Rubin,
kinase levels, the CK
yeah,
levels they
the
call them.
site counts.
Yeah.
You
The
need to
A2s,
understand
all of
all
that.
of that. I mean, even the basic, your hemoglobin.
Yeah.
One of the things our nonprofit do is we share the importance of blood donation.
Mm.
So we found it that from 2018, we started hosting blood drives. And in our community, we realized a lot of our people will come in and would not be able to donate blood because of that low hemoglobin or low iron.
Really?
Yeah. So, we had to go and educate ourselves on, how to eat, how to get that hemoglobin up. But then a lot of people discovered why
Yeah,
it
exactly.
was low. They discovered
Exactly.
at that point why, and that they even had the trait. You
Yes.
know, so that's important as well. So yeah, we need to do an episode on understanding your lab. So like when you do go to the doctor, and I know we had a conversation about this, is getting access to your medical information. So when you do go
Yes.
to the ER, when you do go to your doctor, get the app where you can access your labs and everything, while you're there so you can be informed and know what
Yeah.
your status is, know what your normal levels are. So it's all important. Thank you for the ideas.
Yeah. No, you're pretty welcome.
So I appreciate you. But again, this has been so great. Farron, thank you for sharing your story. We appreciate your voice. We
Thank you.
appreciate your advocacy. I'm going to follow. I'm going to listen. I'm going to learn from you as well because, like I said, our nonprofit, we need to do more when it comes to spreading awareness about sickle cell trait or
Yeah.
the various see, like I have, the various
It
different blood
was it was
traits.
it was rough when I came on the scene in 2010. It was rough because
Oh,
I was so excited that I had found, my voice. And initially, there was a couple of the disease organizations that was like, "What are you talking about? This this is Sickle Cell Awareness Month. This is why you talking about the trait. Like it was like really like, wait a minute, like what is going on? Like we're this is together. And so over the years it's gotten better.
Right.
But it definitely was challenging. My mentor, she was Phyllis Zachary Thomas. She had an organization called the SCD Soldier Network back in when I met her was in 2010. And she was like, Farron, you can work with me because I know how important sickle cell trait is. Most organizations focus on the disease, but I know how important sickle cell trait was. And so it was great to be mentored by a woman. And I don't have that ego because in the military, sometimes I had to have a female captain or a female lieutenant. So my mindset was cool that this woman who had sickle cell anemia saw my voice and saw me as a man and say, hey, I will work with you and I will help you become this advocate so you can take on your conversation. And when she passed away in 2012, it was challenging to find another organization because I had like I said, because she was my mentor. So now who am I going to trust? Now she's gone and now I have to figure out who I can trust. And one thing she told me was, there are people in this organization, in our community. I'm not going to say don't work with them. You will have to figure that out for yourself. So she was even like, I'm not going to tell you who to work with because people will show themselves, but I'm not going to influence you on who you can work with or not. So as a veteran, I know that God allowed me to have that great career because I use that same mentality in my advocacy work for sickle cell trait. And I want people in our community to understand or just relate to me if you can. We need your voice. We need your voice. If you look at the military has E1s all the way up to E9s, and that's the NCO chain. And every person has a role to play in that conversation. And maybe you don't want to be an advocate and talk about your story. Maybe you want to help pass out flyers. Mm-hmm. Maybe you want to help take people's information. Maybe you just want to set up the tables. But we need your voice because you're here for a reason. And I'll say it this way. You're not a burden on your family. Mm-hmm. You're not a burden. Your voice is welcome and it's needed. And so it takes courage, it takes confidence, it takes a way of being in order for you to speak out. So I just want people to know that your voice is just as valuable as mine, because as we speak together, there's certain things about the trait I can't speak to. There's certain things about sickle cell, anemia disease that you can't speak to, but you can speak to your experiences in your conversation. And that all together helps us get this message out unified. And that's really most important for me is how do we do this together? Because it's all of our community, no matter if you're black, white. I met a family messaged me a couple of days ago. She's white and she's having issues getting care because they have sickle cell trait. And the doctors are like, yeah, that's a black thing. Yeah. And so she joined the group, and then I messaged her and she was like, I have no idea about this trait. And I'm like, let me give you some information. And she's white. So she's experiencing what we experience in reverse.
Wow.
Doesn't have to be that way.
No, it doesn't have to. And I'm glad for you to say, if we work together. And I know a couple other advocates that I communicate with, the saying is we're stronger together. We can make change together. We work together. And I want to give a shout out to Dr. Tamia for connecting us with the As One Foundation.
She is a blessing because me having my voice and then her as a researcher, it was like, wow, like we're teammates because she backs up what I get to say about my experiences, and she's done research and she advocates with Dozier as well. So we've joined forces, and I appreciate her for looking out for me and helping us both get our messages out on a global level.
Yeah. Now, Farron, I'm sorry. Can we look at one more comment?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good.
She said, two of my children were diagnosed with hemoglobin SC disease at birth. I was tested a few months ago, but told my results don't show that I have the trait. She may have sickle cell. She has hemoglobin C.
Yeah, you're probably yeah.
Mm,
So again, that's the thing about when we go to the doctor and having those conversations and being informed. So what questions to ask? That's what I feel I get to do. I get to arm families with questions to go back and ask their doctor. So you want to look at your test again, because if your children have SC, one of y'all is a C carrier,
right.
and it's not gonna you may not be the trait carrier, you're the C trait carrier.
Mhm.
And so yeah, that's what happens.
Right.
That's what
Right.
happens is sometimes people aren't aware of how to read the documentation and understanding that SC is two different traits
Mhm.
combined, and that one parent has each one of those inherited genes. So she may be the C trait carrier.
Right. Okay. Well, you guys, I appreciate you all listening. And for those of you who are listening on the replay, I appreciate you listening as well. Make sure you follow Farron. His information is on the screen. I know for sure he's on Facebook.
Yeah.
Follow him.
Probably a little bit too much.
So, but it's all good. Farron, we appreciate you. Thank you for taking a time out of your
Oh,
schedule to
can I
come
say
talk
one
to us.
last thing? Can I say
Oh,
one
yeah,
last thing? Because
absolutely.
and this is for this is for us who have organizations, right? And this is my analogy. You could cross the intersection, and on the four corners you could have Carl's Jr.'s, Wendy's, Burger King, and McDonald's. They all selling burgers, but the people have a choice of where they're gonna go.
Mhm.
So we don't have to dispute about our organizations and how we work together, because people are gonna go to your organization as a group, even as a group of us together. They're gonna figure out who they want to work, but we could all, as owners, work together in that same block. And that's
Absolutely.
my analogy, because sometimes, it seems to be the funding issue gets in the way and blah 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 blah. But at the end of the day, we are stronger if we work together.
Absolutely.
And because it's a business, it is a business.
Mhm.
Nonprofit is still a business,
Right.
and yes, you have to make money and you have to do all these things, but the spirit behind why we're doing this is for the awareness, the education,
Mm.
and the prevention, and for the lives. So yeah, you can have your business separate, but then the spirit behind
Oh,
why we do this is way much bigger than the business.
oh,
So I wanted to say
absolutely.
that so people understand that it is important. And like I said, that's my spiel on the business side of it.
Absolutely. And thank you again. Thank you
Yeah.
again. So what else can I say, everybody?
Hey,
We appreciate you so much. I mean, this is such a great conversation. We will have you back
no
because
doubt.
you know there's never enough, never too much information.
Yeah.
It's always something we can share, always something we can use. So I appreciate you so much talking about sickle cell trait.
I
And
would like
again,
to get you with Dr. Maisha as well. So Dr. Maisha, she's on my board, and a couple of her children have the trait, and so she could speak to the medical part of it. I
okay,
deliver the basic facts, but she can give you more of the medical terminology with the trait and
okay.
things like that to look for. So I would definitely like to set her up with you, um, to
I've
have some
already
kind of
written her
conversation.
name down,
Yeah.
putting a star by it that you're going to discuss.
Shouts out
So,
to Dr. Maisha.
Dr. Maisha, you'll be hearing from me.
Yeah.
So, again, you guys, thank you for listening. Stay tuned. Each Tuesday of this month, we will bring you Tuesday chat with a very important topic. And next Tuesday, we're going to be talking about education
Mm.
during an ongoing pandemic. We're going to be talking to Dr. Tracy Swilly, who is principal of Fairfield Central High School. So stay tuned
Hey.
for that. We will also be having some Tuesday chats on Thursdays this month because, as Farron mentioned, it is Sickle Cell Awareness Month. And we have a lot of information that we want to share with you. So join us and listen up and be on the look out for a Thursday edition of Tuesday Chat. So with that, we'll say good night. Thank you, everybody.